Welcome to this video on the properties of recycled timber. First of all, I'm going to go through with you some ways of possibly identifying the type of timber that you might find. Now, it's pretty hard to identify a timber if you don't already have a fairly clear idea as to what it might be, just by looking at it. But there's some things we can do that will give us a general ballpark of what type of timber it might be, and give us some kind of boundaries around that. So I've got some different pieces of timber here that we can use and have a look at so that we can talk about that. One of the first things that we can use to potentially identify what type of timber it is the previous use of the timber. Okay, so if you've gotten the timber out of an old kitchen cabinet, okay, in a house from the 70s or 80s, then it's most likely going to be something like this, which is probably going to be Meranti, because that was a very, very common timber used in that kind of cabinet construction. Okay, so we know that for sure. All right, some of the more kind of movable furniture around the house is quite often going to be, especially if it's being made in Western Australia, either made of pine or jarrah. Outdoor furniture and things like that, often made of jarrah. On that note, if you do find something and it looks like this, it's nice and grey like this, that's probably going to be jarrah. When it's been left in the sun, it does tend to go with kind of grey colour on the surface, but when you cut through it or sand away that top surface, you can see that it's this nice brown, typical jarrah colour that you're used to. Okay? So just because it's dull and grey like that doesn't actually mean that that's going to be the final colour of the timber necessarily. Okay, so colour is one of the reasons, other things that we can use to check it out and to try and figure out what type of timber it might be. We can have a look at these four pieces here. These are all relatively light coloured timbers. Okay, there's 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, but they're not all the same colour at all. Okay, I'll give you a bit of a better view of those colours. Okay, and so our colour does play some part in it. Okay, we can tell definitely from the colour on some of it. From that point, we then have to go on and look at the grain structure. Okay, so this one here, okay, we can see the grain. It's got a little bit of figure in the grain, but not a lot. Okay, and it's fairly tight grain. It's got this kind of oaky flecked grain, okay, which tells us it's probably some kind of oak. This one here, it's a little bit of an open grain as well, but also very tight grained. Slightly different colour, so we know they're probably not the same, even though there can be some colour variation between trees. This one here, very open grain, very light colour. This one here, slightly darker in colour, but also a fairly open grain. Okay, now other things that we can use is weight. Okay, so I can tell this is fairly heavy, even for the small piece that it is. This is actually fairly light for the size piece it is. This is quite light, and that's a little bit heavier. Okay, from that, I'm going to surmise this is some kind of Australian eucalyptus. Okay, also from what I know we have around here in the workshop, some kind of eucalyptus-y native tree. Okay, this one here, I know it's pine. Okay, I know pine just about anywhere. Okay, because of that grain. Very distinct grain pattern. It's not the only timber that has that, but it's very common in pine and something you're likely to see a lot of. This one here, not 100% sure what this might be. I'd go with some other kind of construction-y kind of timber like your Meranti, but it might not be actually Meranti. Okay. And this one here is a Tasmanian oak or Australian oak because it's not quite the salmony colour of Tasmanian oak. Okay, but it has that flex, that kind of feature and figure through the grain there. Anything with this kind of bird's eye grain is going to be either she oak or silky oak or something similar to that. It's very easy to identify that kind of a timber. Okay. Now you can't always see the grain clearly. You might end up with a rough sawn bit of timber. Okay, and that's going to come down to a little bit of guesswork, or you're not going to know what that exactly is or looks like until you can clean it up on a plane or a thicknesser. The other thing that might help you identify the timber is the smell. Some timbers do have a really strong smell. So your camphor laurel, for example, your cedars, your western red cedar, some of those, they have super, super distinctive smells. Okay, Now you're not going to smell that if it's got a finish covering the surface, but if you don't, then that'll give you a bit of an idea as to what it might be as well. Now some of them that are tricky to tell between are things like Carry and Jarrah. They both look exceptionally similar and are very similar colour and weight. Okay, one does tend to behave a lot more nicely than the other, but it's not impossible to work with Carry. So if you're not sure, it's still, but it's in a really good condition, then there's a good bet that it's going to be something you can use and work with nicely. Okay, what to avoid in timber pieces that you come across and how to check for them. Anything that's got nails, screws or sand embedded in it, we want to try and avoid those. Anyway, this won't have my nails in it. Okay, you can see there's nails and I can't remove them. Okay, they're stuck in there. If you want to use any kind of machine to cut this material up and work with it, it's going to end up causing you to go through blades and cutters if you hit any of those nails, especially when they are tricky little ones you can't see very well. So if there's any evidence that there could be nails hidden in your timber, you want to avoid it. Now there is expensive equipment you can buy that'll tell you where these things are, but if there's any risk of it, you just want to try and avoid that. Don't worry about trying to buy expensive equipment. Not all nails are necessarily going to be picked up by a magnet either, so just be aware of that too. Sand is another one. Sometimes pieces that have been used outdoors can have sand embedded into it if it's been used in that kind of environment. Avoid, avoid, avoid. Also will damage blades and cutters, etc. when you're using it. Okay, so you want to try and avoid those kinds of, anything really super abrasive that's going to be embedded into your material. Okay, I don't have a good example of this. Hopefully I'll have a picture that will turn up on the screen. Anything that is rotted, has significant discoloration or has evidence of mould. So if there are tiny little black spots on the surface of your timber dotted around, okay, or you know that the timber's been significantly wet or soaked in the past, avoid using that timber. Okay, it's not going to work well, and rotting timber has a massive variety of different kind of consistencies through the timber, and some of it can just fall apart on you. So you want to try and avoid that. Mold, of course, dangerous to breathe in, so while you could technically get rid of it off the surface, you don't want to breathe that dust in. Plus, mold has got what they call feet, and they will, anything where it's porous, they'll actually embed themselves much deeper into the timber than you realise, or the surface of something that you realise, unless you can effectively submerge the entire piece and have the entire piece be completely saturated all the way through with something like a bleach, or heat the entire thing up over a certain temperature for a sustained period of time all the way through. You're not going to kill off the mould, so it'll still be there. So not only do you run the risk of yourself breathing in those dangerous mould spores while you're sanding it back, even putting a coating on it, it's not necessarily going to prevent that mould from coming back through and eating away at your timber from the inside out. Okay, anything with cracks and end splits or end checks. Okay, this is a crack in timber. Okay, that's most likely been caused by something within the timber itself. And as we go along, you can see that there are also just little cracks from it drying out, and some significant cracks the further along we go. Anything that's like that, pass up on that. Say thanks for the offer, but no thank you. Okay, it's going to be a never-ending, painful surprise of things. Okay, a few more along the side there. Okay, that is often timber that's dried out, so it's been left in the sun or out in the weather, and it's been wet and then heated up again, and then wetted again and heated up again, and it's caused it to kind of expand like that. Okay, so you want to try and avoid anything like that. End checks tend to be a little bit different, but similar kind of thing. Okay, if you see any kind of cracks on the surface that are following the grain like that, you really want to avoid that piece of material, unless you've got a significant length of it and it's only at the very, very end of the piece. Okay. Okay, excessive movement. Movement in timber is what we call the kind of change that happens to it. It's usually after it's been completely dried or down to its moisture content, dryness, that cause the timber to not be flat anymore. There are 4 different types of movement to look for. Okay, I'm going to use this piece here to illustrate this. Forgive my shaky cameraman skills. Okay, so we've got 4 different types. The first 2, we look down the length of the timber to look for. Looking down the length, we're going to see if it bows, which is where it kind of curves in that direction. Okay, so if we look at our timber and it's curving in that direction, that's a bow. We've got then a warp or a twist where it can start like that and end up like that as it moves along. Now, you should be able to see, because I could see it through looking at this just now, that it goes reasonably straight for a majority of this piece, and then towards the end there, it kicks out to the right. So depending on what I need of this and how much of it I need, this could be still a good piece of timber to use. Anything that is warped the whole way along, you probably want to avoid. Okay? Checking for the other 2 types of movements, which is cupping and springing. Cupping is where you have the end of it cup either up like that or like that. So you'll look at the very end of your material to see if it's cupped at all. Okay, this one looks pretty good. And then look down the length to see if it is sprung, which is where it kind of springs out like that along this side. Okay? And again, this one's, I was wondering why it wasn't responding the way I needed it to. This one's looking pretty good for that. Okay, it's not having any of that I can see. Significant cupping. This piece here before it split had a significant cup in it. Okay, you can still see that cup even now with the piece that's been split. Because the thinness of this, okay, to try and get a clean section out of this that's not damaged, we would have to mill this whole section, this side here, down to that there, and then whatever met up with that wasn't that from that bit there, and that's the only part that we would actually get out of it. It's probably 2 or 3 mil thick board out of something like this because of how severe that cup is. So try and avoid anything with severe movement. Now you can see when I place them on top of each other like that, upside down, how much there actually is. Okay, anything with severe movement. A slight amount of movement, that's not too bad, assuming you've got a thick enough or large enough piece that you can actually mill it down to remove that. Okay, anything with very old paint. Okay, very old paint, avoid unless you know for sure that it is not lead-based paint. So depending on the age of where you're getting it from, anything with large amounts of glue over the surface, okay, where that surface is the whole face or a whole edge. Okay, it's just on the end grain and you can cut it off, that's not so bad. Anything like this is pretty much bin material. There's no point in us looking at this, and this glue can also damage teeth on cutters and things, okay? So we want to avoid that. Okay, treated pine. Typically, if it's that kind of colour or a similar blue tinge to it, then it is treated pine and you want to avoid it. They've changed their treatment techniques up these days, but we don't have any clear way of knowing whether it's an old treated pine or a new treated pine, and old treated pine was treated with arsenic. So you really want to avoid that. Some pallets can be treated pine, so you really want to make sure that it is not, if you're going to use pallet wood, that it is not treated pine that's been used to make that pallet, okay? Same as if you're using it for a garden bed, you don't want, or for veggies especially, you don't want to have treated pine garden beds soaking arsenic into your foods. Okay? Last thing, insect damage. Having insect damage on your timber is not necessarily a game breaker. Okay, sometimes it can be used as a bit of a feature. You see there, one of those is a nail hole, the rest of it is actually insect damage. What you do want to avoid though is if it's excessive, or if there's active insect activity. Okay, you laugh at that, but somebody brought in a log a couple of years ago now to use for a project, and it was sitting in D3, and I was sitting at the desk one afternoon There's no noise happening around, and I could hear this kind of scratchy noise. And I went over there and it was sitting on a chair, and just below a hole, there was a little pile of sawdust. Okay, so you want to avoid any active insect activity. You should be able to hear it. Okay, what to look for? Try to look for timber that has been dressed on at least 2 surfaces. Okay, so what is dressed timber? You've got rough sawn timber, which looks kind of like this. Okay, if this is the really rough cutting that they do when they put it through the initial cutting up process, and on all 4 edges, it's super rough surface. Okay. When they are then looking to actually produce from those usable boards to sell in a shop, they call it dressing the timber. Okay. This one here has been now nicely dressed. You can see how much smoother that surface is by comparison. Okay, now something like this is called dressed all round, or DAR timber if you were purchasing it. Okay, whereas this is called rough sawn. Because you're looking for recycled timber, you might find stuff that's not actually completely dressed, but has got some dressed edges to it, and that's good. That's still okay, as long as you've got at least 2 surfaces. Okay, hopefully adjacent. Okay, that one and that one is dressed, then you can put it through the thicknesser and mill the opposite faces down to match. Anything that's rough all around requires using the planer, which means you need to have a teacher to do that for you. Okay, and it's usually quite a bit of work to get it down, and there's not an easy way of teaching you how much material you're going to end up getting out of that at the end. Okay, so try and avoid your rough sawn timbers as much as possible. You can't work with them in the state that they're in because you can't guarantee a flat edge for straight cuts. Okay, and they're tricky to, and you have to get a teacher who's got the time to mill them down for you. Okay, so try looking for either all dressed timber, dressed all round timber, or partially dressed timber that you can use. If you're going to need to mill it down, make sure the material is larger than what you need it to be. If this had some movement to it that I needed to get rid of, there's no way that I could count on having that whole thickness and that whole width. Okay, so keep an eye on that and keep that in your thoughts. If you've got some movement in your timber or some damage to it and you do need to mill it down, then think about how much you're actually going to lose out of that, and is that piece still big enough for what you need. Okay, you want to try and have as few holes as possible in your timber and avoid things like lots of knots and other defects and things that you might find if you're getting construction grade pine, for example. There's going to be a lot more knots in it. Try and avoid having, especially a lot of the really dried knots, but avoiding knots as much as possible is going to help prevent your timber from being excessively warped as well. With this one with lots of insect holes, as I said, it's not too bad, but if you had lots of drill holes in it, that's going to get in the way of your design at some point as well, and make it really tricky for you to have cuts that aren't going to be interfered with by the holes in the timber. Okay. Try to look for material that's unfinished or has been finished with something really light, like a wax or an oil, that's really easy to remove, okay? That way you don't have to worry so much about stripping back a whole large amount of varnish or paint from the surface. If you do have a painted surface piece of material, okay, then make sure again that you're going to have enough space and thickness there to mill away that paint or varnish, because that is the fastest way of getting rid of it, okay? So make sure it's a bit thicker or a bit wider or both than what you need, so you've got enough space to get rid of that. Okay, the last thing to be really wary of is making sure that your timber is actually natural timber. Sometimes you might find a piece that looks something like this. Looks really nice on all 4 sides. Okay, looks really straight and perfect, and you go, wow, I've really hit a good one here. But then you look at the end grain and it's actually chipboard or MDF. Okay, so really be wary of that. Just because it looks like natural timber doesn't mean it is going to be natural timber. Typically you can figure that out because it's going to be a lot heavier, okay, than normal pieces, unless it's something like your Australian oak, which is quite dense anyway. But that's a good indicator. If it looks like pine, but it's got the weight of jarrah behind it, then it's probably not a natural timber. But typically they don't use pine as the veneer in these things. So always check and really make sure that on the end grain that it has an end grain really, because if it's veneered all the way around, this will also look like side grain. Okay, so make sure that is also end grain. Okay, and you can see that typical pattern that you might get from quarter sawn, or I can't think of the other one now, the other type of sawing. Okay, so look for those. Okay, places that you can find some of this stuff. Okay, anyone that's got, does a bit of woodwork is likely to have a decent amount of natural timber offcuts and scraps and rubbish and things lying around. Farm properties are great as well, so if you know someone who's got a farm, they might have some scrap timbers and stuff lying around. Okay, verge collections, technically speaking, even though it's on the verge, the front verge of someone's house, it still technically belongs to the owner or occupant of the house. Okay, so if you did want to take something off the verge, you can just go and knock on the door and ask. Okay, now I don't know that anyone's ever been arrested for taking stuff off a verge, but I do need to put that little bit of legal stuff in there. A lot of your larger tips will actually have tip shops where things that have been put on verges that they've collected can be sold. Okay, so you might be able to get some cheap stuff that way, or even buying a cheap item of furniture that you can break down and use the timber from that. Ask your friends and family if they've got any broken furniture and things around the place that you might be able to go and inspect and grab from that. You might also be able to get some offcuts, or asked to go through the offcuts bin of anywhere that is a cabinet maker, carpenter or timber merchant. Okay, so they may charge you a small amount for it, but it won't be anywhere near what it's actually worth. So if you only needed really small pieces, then that might be a good option for you. Also, timber merchants and some timber sales places will actually also have offcuts sections where they can't sell it because it's now a shorter length, but they will charge you a very small amount for it, or a different amount for it. And some places actually deal in recycled materials. Okay, so you're not necessarily going to get a cheaper option there, but it's a way where you can find and purchase recycled materials without having to do a huge amount of work. Okay, so some places that I know do this, Bunnings do, or some Bunnings shops, if they have a cut shop in the Bunnings store, they may have a box of offcuts there that you can go through. It's not all going to be natural timber, but it's something that you can look through and try out if that's a place that you frequent. Close by to us here, Fremantle Timber Traders, they do recycled timber. So that if you're happy to go and purchase your timber, go to them, say, look, I need to have recycled timber. Can you point me in the direction of anything here in your shop that's recycled? They do a lot of jarrah and some other materials as well. But yeah, excellent place to go and have a wander through. And you can ask them some questions about machines, the machines and stuff they have there as well, which is pretty cool to know and going to be super useful for you for your externally set tasks next year probably as well. And another place that's really good to go to is the Timber Bloke. He also has a good offcuts bin there, and there may be some small charges depending on what the materials are that you need. Massive range of native timbers there. He has some kilns on site and some other large equipment as well, plus a massive timber mill down at the back there. Last time I went anyway. So if you go to any of those two places, Fremantle Timber Traders or the Timber Bloke, ask to have a good look around and have him explain some of the stuff to you, because it's really good background understanding stuff from there as well. Okay, obviously not limited to those places. Those are just the ones that are off the top of my head and or around here, but there's heaps of other places that you can find that pop up occasionally or that you might know of that sell timber. Any of those kind of places are good to go to and have a look at. Alrighty. Any other questions about that, please come and ask me. All right, if you're having issues as well, make sure you do come and ask me as well. Alrighty, everyone. See you in class.